Walking weapons. As Ruda's army pressed deeper into the heart of Kasin, they were confronted by a formidable and unexpected adversary. The very ground beneath their feet had become their enemy. The streets, houses, and alleys were laced with mines, scattered like deadly seeds, lying in wait for the unwary. The city's once bustling and orderly environment had been transformed into a treacherous labyrinth of traps and dangers, each step fraught with the risk of sudden and violent death. With the Birai's defenses weakened by the ravaging cholera epidemic, Kasin's remaining defenders had turned to desperate measures. The city's bears, embodying the fierce spirit of resistance, took the lead in defending their homeland. But this was no ordinary defense. The bears, renowned for their strength and courage, had become walking weapons, strapped with bombs around their massive bodies, each determined to take as many guerrillists with them as possible. Recognizing the imminent threat posed by the mine-laden streets, Ruda swiftly devised a strategy to navigate the treacherous terrain. He divided his forces into smaller, more agile groups, each tasked with a specific objective. The goal was to minimize casualties while maximizing the effectiveness of their advance, a challenging feat given the unpredictable nature of urban warfare. As the guerrillist soldiers ventured deeper into Kasin, explosions erupted with deafening intensity, each blast a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked around every corner. The deadly symphony of mines claimed numerous lives, yet Ruda, undeterred by the mounting casualties, remained resolute in his determination to press forward. His command echoed through the chaos, rallying his troops to continue their advance despite the harrowing obstacles they faced. But the mines were only the beginning. In the chaotic war zone, a surreal and terrifying encounter unfolded. From the shadows of a crumbling building, a massive bear emerged, its fur matted with blood and dust. Strapped tightly around its body was a crude but effective bomb belt. In its powerful paws, it clutched a machete, the blade glinting ominously in the dim light. The sight was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The bear, despite its injuries, charged forward with an almost supernatural determination, seemingly impervious to the barrage of bullets that rained down upon it. With each step, the ground shook beneath its weight, and its growls echoed through the streets, a chilling reminder of the primal force that lay behind its attack. The guerrillist soldiers, trained and battle-hardened, were unprepared for such a foe. They fired their weapons in a desperate attempt to stop the bear's advance, but the creature pressed on, its eyes burning with a fierce intensity. With a strength born of desperation and an unyielding resolve, the bear swung its machete with deadly precision, cutting down the soldiers who stood in its path. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city, the bear triggered the bomb belt strapped to its body. The resulting explosion was devastating, sending a shockwave through the streets of Kasin. Shrapnel flew in all directions, tearing through flesh and bone, leaving death and destruction in its wake. The suddenness and ferocity of the attack caught the guerrillist forces off guard, their ranks thrown into disarray as they struggled to comprehend the scale of the devastation. But the bear was not alone. Similar acts of self-sacrifice were carried out by other bears throughout Kasin, each one a grim testament to the resolve of Birai's defenders. In one corner of the city, a bear disguised as a wounded civilian approached a group of guerrillist soldiers seeking aid. As they drew near, the bear revealed the bomb strapped to its chest and detonated it, taking the soldiers with it. In another part of Kasin, a bear waited silently in a ruined building. When a squad of guerrillist soldiers entered, the bear launched itself at them, tearing through their ranks with its powerful claws before setting off the explosives strapped to its back. The building collapsed in the explosion, burying the soldiers and the bear under a mountain of rubble. As these suicides unfolded across the city, the guerrillist forces found themselves in a state of shock. They had expected resistance, but nothing like this. The bears of Birai's, driven to the edge by desperation and a fierce love for their homeland, had turned themselves into living weapons. Each bear that fell took with it a piece of the guerrillist army, a reminder that Kasin would not be taken easily. General Blura, though saddened by the loss of life, knew that these sacrifices were necessary. The bears had chosen to fight and die on their own terms, rather than live under the yoke of the guerrillist invaders. They had become martyrs, their names and deeds etched into the history of Birai's. For Ruda and his forces, the realization that they were facing an enemy willing to embrace death so readily was sobering. The advance into Kasin slowed as every street, every corner, became a potential death trap. The once orderly campaign had descended into chaos, with every victory overshadowed by the cost in lives. As the guerrillist army pushed further into Kasin, they knew that the battle was far from over. The Bears of Birais had shown that they would not surrender, that they would fight to the last breath. And as the guerrillist soldiers stepped cautiously through the ruined city, they could not shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The breaking point. As the guerrillist forces relentlessly approached the capital city of Kasin, the landscape bore witness to the grim aftermath of Birais' unconventional and deadly suicide tactics. The streets were littered with the remains of both guerrillist soldiers and the animals-turned-suicide bombers that had wreaked havoc upon Ruda's army. The toll on the guerrillist forces was devastating, with thousands of lives lost in the face of Birais' fierce resistance. Yet, amidst the chaos and carnage, Ruda remained undeterred, his determination unyielding in the face of adversity. With each step closer to Kasin, the sounds of explosions and gunfire intensified, creating a surreal symphony of death and destruction. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and the metallic tang of blood, a constant reminder of the relentless battle being waged for control of the city. Meter by meter, the guerrillist army tightened its siege on Kasin, their advance slowed but not halted by the relentless onslaught of Birais' self-destructive strategy. Meanwhile, back in the corridors of power, President Birais and General Blura engaged in a heated debate over the possibility of surrender. The meeting was set in the presidential palace, a place that had once symbolized the hope and pride of Birais, but was now a fortress under siege, both literally and figuratively. General Blura, a battle-hardened commander with a fierce loyalty to his nation, pounded the table, his voice reverberating through the room. "Surrender is not an option," he thundered. "To lay down our arms now would be to spit on the graves of those who have given their lives for Birais. We cannot betray them by capitulating to the guerrillists." President Birais, his face pale and drawn, sat across from Blura, his fingers drumming anxiously on the armrest of his chair. The weight of the war and the mounting casualties had taken a visible toll on him. He spoke with a quiet, strained voice, one that contrasted sharply with Blura's fervor. "General, I understand your passion, but at what cost do we continue this fight? Look around you, our people are dying. Kasin is on the brink of collapse. If we do not act now, there will be nothing left of Birais to save." Blura's eyes blazed with anger. "You talk of saving Birais, but you would hand it over to our enemies on a silver platter. Our people are ready to die for their country, and you would rob them of that honor? You would rob Birais of its dignity?" President Birais leaned forward, his voice growing more urgent. "And what dignity will there be in a city of corpses? What honor is there in annihilation? We must think of the future, Blura. A future where Birais can rebuild, even if it means making hard choices now." Blura's expression darkened, his hands clenched into fists. "A future built on surrender is no future at all. We are soldiers, Birais. We were born to fight, to protect our land, our people. I will not let Birais fall while I still draw breath." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Birais, sensing that the conversation was reaching a dangerous crescendo, tried to appeal to Blura's sense of duty. "General, you have led our forces with honor and bravery, but this war has taken a turn that none of us could have predicted. The enemy has used tactics that have decimated our ranks, and the city cannot withstand much more. We need to find a way to survive this." Blura interrupted, his voice icy with contempt. "Survival? At the cost of our souls? I would rather die at 1,000 deaths than live under guerrillist rule. And I believe the people of Birais feel the same." President Birais opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Blura reached into his uniform and drew a gun. The suddenness of the action froze everyone in the room. Birais' eyes widened in shock, his hand instinctively reaching out as if to ward off the impending danger. "Blura," Birais whispered, his voice trembling. "Think about what you're doing." But Blura's resolve was unshakable. He leveled the gun at Byrus, his hand steady, his eyes filled with cold determination. "I am thinking, Byrus. I am thinking about Birais, about what must be done to protect it. You have failed our nation. You have lost sight of what it means to lead." At that moment, the weight of the decision bore heavily on Blura. He knew that what he was about to do would change the course of history, but in his mind, it was the only way to ensure Birais' survival. With a final, decisive move, Blura pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed throughout the room, followed by the terrifying thud of Byrus's body hitting the floor. The room fell deathly silent, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the lingering echoes of violence. Blura stood over the president's body, his expression unreadable, his heart weighed down by the knowledge of what he had done. But there was no time to ponder, no time for regret. Blura turned to the stunned faces of the remaining officials and soldiers in the room. "There will be no surrender," he declared, his voice cold and hard as steel. "We fight to the last breath. Birais will not fall." With that, Blura put away his weapon and walked out of the room, leaving President Byrus's lifeless body behind. The message was clear: Birais would continue to fight, not for survival, but for honor, for pride, and for the memory of those who had died. The streets of Kasin would be red with blood before the guerrillists claimed victory. And as the city prepared for the final assault, the spirit of resistance, embodied by the indomitable figure of General Blura, remained unbroken. The people of Birais, inspired by his unwavering determination, prepared for the coming battle, knowing that even in the face of certain death, they would never surrender. No surrender, no retreat. General Blura strode out of the presidential palace, the weight of his actions pressing heavily on his shoulders. Yet, his resolve was unwavering. The choice he had made, to kill President Byrus and take control of the nation's defense, was not one he took lightly. But in his eyes, it was a necessary act to preserve the honor and dignity of Birais, a nation that would rather face annihilation than bow to the tyranny of the guerrillists. As he walked through the streets of Kasin, the sounds of distant explosions and gunfire filled the air, a constant reminder of the battle raging on the city's outskirts. The sight of his soldiers, battered but determined, filled him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. These men and women were ready to give their lives for Birais, and Blura knew that it was his duty to lead them, even if it meant leading them to their deaths. Blura's first task as the new leader of Birais was to address the nation. He knew that the people were scared, exhausted, and desperate for hope. They needed to know that their sacrifices were not in vain, that there was still something worth fighting for. He needed to rally them for the final stand, to ignite the flames of resistance in their hearts. Gathering his top military officials and advisors, Blura made his way to the Central Command Center, where he would deliver his address. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The officials and soldiers present knew what had happened to President Byrus, and they understood the gravity of the situation. Yet, they looked to Blura for guidance, for the strength to carry on. Blura stepped up to the podium, his face a mask of determination. The cameras were already rolling, broadcasting his image to every corner of the nation. The people of Birais, huddled in their homes and shelters, gathered around radios and televisions, waiting for the words of the man who had taken the reins of their country. "People of Birais," Blura began, his voice steady and firm, "we stand at the precipice of our nation's most difficult trial. Our enemy, the guerrillists, has brought war to our doorstep, threatening to destroy everything we hold dear. They have used every weapon at their disposal to break our spirit, to force us into submission. But I stand before you today to tell you this: Birais will not fall." His words echoed through the room and across the airwaves, reaching the ears of every citizen, every soldier. There was a power in his voice, a conviction that resonated with those who heard it. Our enemies believe that they can break us with their might, that they can shatter our wool with their bombs and bullets. But they underestimate the strength of our resolve, the courage that runs through the veins of every Birais citizen. We are not a nation that surrenders. We are a nation that fights, a nation that stands tall in the face of adversity. Blura paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the eyes of his audience on him, could sense the rising tension, the flicker of hope beginning to ignite. President Virus, in his wisdom, sought a way to protect our people, to preserve our future. But I say to you now, there can be no future for Virus if we surrender to the guerrillists. There can be no peace if it is born from submission. We will not live under the yoke of an oppressor. We will not trade our freedom for safety. His voice grew louder, more passionate, as he continued. We have lost much in this war. Our cities lie in ruins, our fields are barren, and our people are weary. But we have not lost our spirit. We have not lost our pride. And we will fight for those who have already given their lives, for the children who deserve to grow up in a free Virus, for the future generations who will look back on this day and remember our courage. Blura's eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of each person present. I will not lie to you. The road ahead is dark, and the cost will be high. But I ask you, what is the price of our freedom? Is it not worth everything we have, everything we are? There was a murmur of agreement, a growing sense of unity among those gathered. Blura could feel the shift, the change in the atmosphere. The people were ready, the soldiers prepared to follow him to the very end. We will defend Kasin to the last breath. We will turn every street, every building, every stone into a fortress. The guerrillists will know the true meaning of resistance. They will understand that Virus does not bow, does not break. We fight for our homeland, for our families, for our honor. And if we must die, we will die as free people. The room erupted in applause, a thunderous sound that reverberated through the walls. Blura could see the fire in their eyes, the determination to see this fight through, no matter the cost. As the applause died down, Blura took a deep breath and delivered his final words. Let this be a message to the guerrillists: we are not afraid of you. We will not cower before your might. You may kill us, you may destroy our cities, but you will never conquer our spirit. Virus stands strong, and we will fight until the very end. With that, Blura stepped away from the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the battle for Kasin, for Virus, was far from over. But he also knew that he had ignited a fire in the hearts of his people, a fire that would not easily be extinguished. As he left the command center, Blura felt a sense of calm settle over him. The weight of leadership was heavy, but he carried it with pride. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Virus would fight, and Blura would lead them, through the darkest days, to whatever end awaited them. Outside, the sounds of war continued, a constant reminder of the battle raging just beyond the walls of the city. But within those walls, there was a new resolve, a renewed strength in the people who had chosen to stand and fight, no matter the odds. For Blura and the people of Virus, there was no surrender, no retreat. There was only the fight, and they would see it through to the bitter end. The last stand of Virus. The presidential palace loomed ahead, a fortress of resistance in the heart of the crumbling city of Kasin. The guerrillist army, driven by an unyielding determination, pressed forward relentlessly, their sights fixed on this final stronghold. The streets of Kasin, once vibrant with life, now lay desolate and ravaged, the aftermath of brutal warfare etched into every stone, every shattered window. The echoes of gunfire and the roar of artillery reverberated through the ruins, a grim symphony heralding the fall of a once proud nation. General Blura, now the last bastion of Virus military command, stood alone in the dimly lit quarters of the presidential palace. The weight of his nation's fate pressed heavily upon him, the burden of leadership a crushing force on his weary shoulders. The end was near. He knew it as surely as he knew the faces of the fallen soldiers who had given their lives under his command. The guerrillist forces were closing in, their numbers overwhelming, their resolve unbreakable. The loudspeakers echoing through the streets carried the message of surrender, a haunting reminder of the inevitable. Blura's thoughts turned to the Esther rabbits, the seemingly innocuous creatures that had unwittingly become instruments of death. It was a brilliant strategy by the guerrillists, he had to admit, a stroke of diabolical genius. The rabbits had been a symbol of false hope, a fleeting reprieve that had lured his soldiers into a deadly trap. Blura cursed himself for allowing his men to fall into that trap, for failing to see the poison hidden beneath the surface. The once simple and comforting meal had become a harbinger of doom, and now the effects were impossible to reverse. In the quiet of his quarters, Blura's mind raced with memories of Birais before the war, memories of a nation brimming with life, of streets filled with laughter and joy. He remembered the dreams he had for Birais, the hopes of building a nation that would stand as a beacon of strength and resilience. Those dreams now lay in ruins, much like the city that surrounded him. The faces of fallen comrades haunted him, their sacrifices a testament to the price of war, a price that now seemed too high to bear. The weight of his responsibility bore down on him like a physical force. The men and women who had trusted him to lead, the civilians who had looked to him for protection, the legacy of a nation, all rested on his shoulders. But as the guerrillist forces drew closer, Blura realized that there was nothing left to protect, nothing left to save. Birais was a nation on the brink of collapse, its people broken, its future all but extinguished. As he stood in the silence of his quarters, Blura's gaze fell upon the photograph of his family, a reminder of the life he once had, a life now lost to the chaos of war. His wife's smile, his children's laughter, all seemed like distant echoes, remnants of a world that no longer existed. The memories brought a pang of sorrow, a deep, aching grief that gnawed at his soul. Blura knew what had to be done. The time for defiance had passed, and all that remained was a single, final act. He had led his people to this point, and now he would bear the consequences of his decisions. With a heavy heart, he reached for his gun, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories that filled his mind. He sat down at his desk, the gun resting in his hand, and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the faces of those who had fallen, the soldiers who had fought valiantly to the end, the civilians who had suffered under the weight of a war they never asked for. He saw the city of Kasin, once a symbol of Birais' strength, now reduced to rubble by the relentless advance of the guerrillist army. Blura's thoughts turned to the future, a future he would not live to see. He wondered what history would say about him, about the choices he had made, about the nation that had fallen under his watch. Would they remember him as a hero, a man who fought to the end for his country? Or would they see him as a tragic figure, a leader who led his people to ruin? The answers would not matter, for he would not be there to hear them. With a deep breath, Blura raised the gun to his temple. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a profound sense of resignation. The war was over, at least for him. The struggle, the pain, the loss, all of it would end in a single moment. In his final act, Blura would take responsibility for his failures, for the defeat of Birais, and for the lives that had been lost. The gunshot echoed through the room, a sharp crack that shattered the silence. General Blura slumped forward, the weight of his burden finally lifted in death. The man who had once been the hope of Birais was now gone, his life taken by his own hand, a final act of defiance against a world that had taken everything from him. Outside, the battle raged on, the sounds of war filling the streets of Kasin. The guerrillist army pressed ever closer to the presidential palace, unaware that the man who had led the defense of Birais was now no longer among the living. The fall of Kasin was inevitable, the collapse of Birais certain. But in that final moment, General Blura had found peace, a release from the torment that had consumed him. As the guerrillist forces closed in, the city of Kasin prepared for its final stand. The soldiers who remained, their numbers dwindling, would fight to the last, their resistance a tribute to the man who had led them. They would hold the line, not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in Birais, and the spirit of a nation that refused to surrender. The end was near, but the legacy of General Blura and the people of Birais would live on, a testament to the courage, the sacrifice, and the unyielding resolve of a nation that faced the full might of an invader and fought to the very last breath. The war would end, but the memory of Birais' last stand would endure, a symbol of resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. In the ashes of Kasin, amidst the ruins of a city and the bodies of the fallen, the spirit of Birais would remain, a reminder that even in defeat, there is honor. And that honor, above all else, was worth dying for. The ashes of triumph. As Ruda traversed the desolate landscape of Birais, his footsteps echoed through the ruins of what was once a proud and prosperous nation. The aftermath of guerrillists' victory lay before him, a grim tableau of destruction and despair. Ashes smoldered amidst the rubble, and the acrid scent of smoke hung heavy in the air, a poignant reminder of the fierce battle that had raged across the land. The ruler's contemplative gaze swept across the devastated landscape, taking in the haunting remnants of a nation brought to its knees by the relentless advance of guerrillist forces. The once thriving cities lay in ruins, their grand buildings reduced to crumbling facades. The streets, once bustling with life, now stood eerily silent, their emptiness a stark testament to the toll of war. As Ruda walked through the decimated streets, he noticed the small details that painted a broader picture of the human cost of his campaign: a child's toy, abandoned in the dirt, a family portrait, singed at the edges, lying among the debris, and the broken pieces of what were once thriving businesses and homes, now left in shambles. These small relics of everyday life, now lost, drove home the staggering price of his victory. Yet amid the desolation, there lingered a silent sorrow, a profound mourning for all that had been lost. Mass graves dotted the landscape, each one a somber reminder of the countless lives sacrificed in the name of victory. The cost of triumph was etched into the very fabric of Birais, a scar that would endure for generations to come. As his thoughts lingered on the destruction, Ruda couldn't help but wonder if the victory he had sought so fervently had been worth the price. In Ruda's contemplative mind, contrasting images began to emerge, the exuberance of triumph juxtaposed against the profound sorrow of loss. These two faces of war, each bearing its own weight of consequence, painted a vivid portrait of the conflict that had torn Birais apart. The resounding cheers of victory from his generals now seemed hollow in the face of the devastation that lay before him. He had won the war, but at what cost? As he approached the presidential palace, the symbolic heart of Birais' former power, Ruda's mind turned to the departed General Blura. This was the place where Blura, the indomitable leader of Birais, had taken his own life rather than surrender. There was a time when Ruda might have felt satisfaction at the thought, but now, standing amidst the ruins of a nation, he felt only a deep, unsettling void. With a mix of triumph and contemplation, Ruda questioned the sacrifices that had been made in the name of victory. Was the price of triumph worth the devastation that had been wrought upon Birais? And what of General Blura, hailed as a hero in the annals of guerrillist history? What legacy did he leave behind in the ashes of a defeated nation? These questions gnawed at Ruda as he wandered the halls of the now silent presidential palace, once the seat of power in Birais, now an empty shell. In the quiet solitude of the room where General Blura had taken his own life, Ruda found himself grappling with these questions. The room was a stark, haunting reminder of the finality of war and the cost of absolute resistance. The blood-stained floor, the remnants of Blura's final moments, spoke volumes about the weight of leadership and the agony of defeat. Ruda pondered the worthiness of such sacrifices, questioning the true nature of heroism in the face of such overwhelming destruction. Was General Blura truly a hero, or merely a pawn in a larger game of power and dominance? As he stood in that room, Ruda realized that the true legacy of Birais' defeat would be written not in the annals of history, but in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed its fall. The people who had lived through the horrors of the war would carry the memories with them, passing down stories of both courage and tragedy to future generations. Though victory had been achieved, it had come at a staggering cost, one that would be felt long after the echoes of war had faded into memory. For Ruda, the scars of war ran deep, their mark etched upon the very soul of guerrillist. More than half of his army had fallen in the bloody conflict, their sacrifices a solemn reminder of the brutality of war. And though victory had been achieved, it had come at a heavy price, one that Ruda would carry with him for the rest of his days. The faces of the fallen, the countless soldiers who had died for his cause, haunted him, a constant reminder that every triumph is accompanied by loss. As he left the presidential palace and walked back through the ruins of Kasin, Ruda's mind was a tumultuous sea of conflicting emotions. The thrill of victory had long since faded, replaced by a deep, pervasive melancholy. The once clear path of conquest now seemed shrouded in doubt and uncertainty. He had won the war, but in doing so, had he lost something far more important? Had the destruction of Birais been a necessary evil, or had it simply been evil? Ruda could not answer these questions, not yet. The weight of what had been done, the lives lost, and the cities destroyed, hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him like a physical force. The victory that once seemed so sweet now tasted bitter, tainted by the blood of innocence and the ashes of a nation that had been crushed beneath the heel of his ambition. Ruda could not shake the feeling that the echoes of his conquest would follow him, haunting him for the rest of his life. The war was over, but the scars it had left on the land, and on his soul, would never fully heal.